Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk about a role in military aviation and military combat that is a sort of unsung hero. A role that doesn't get all that much glory in the grand scheme of things, but is nevertheless an important and honestly vital part of fighting a war that involves a large body of water. And considering most of the world is made of water, that's a lot of wars. And that is the role of the anti-ship aircraft. For the Second World War, what would you figure is probably the most famous anti-ship aircraft? Perhaps the Grumman TBF Avenger, maybe? It certainly gets some bonus street cred for taking out the Yamato, and it was quite effective overall, but past the Avenger, what else comes to mind? Maybe kamikaze aircraft in general are kind of anti-ship aircraft by nature, or at least that's the way they were used, and as a group they're probably more famous than the Avenger, but they weren't all that effective at actually destroying enemy ships. Once you move past those two planes, or two groups of planes, you start to get to your more niche stalwarts of the class, like the Bristol Beaufort, and Fairey Swordfish and Barracuda, planes that do have some fame, but largely operated more in the background, while your frontline fighters and bombers take more of the historical glory and attention. So, with this general topic in mind, there's a different question. What Axis plane, or planes plural, destroyed the most Allied vessels? Which Axis aircraft were some of the most damaging, deadly, and prolific in air-to-sea combat? It's these questions that I wish to answer today, and our subjects for today are some of the most prolific Axis anti-ship aircraft in the Second World War, oftentimes teaming up with one another to create a deadly duo. This is the Aichi D3A, known simply by Allied forces as VAL, and the Nakajima B5N, known simply as Kate. The story of these two planes begins a few years before the start of World War II and before the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War, with Japan looking to keep pace with the rest of the world and modernize their stable of carrier-based aircraft. For dive and torpedo bombers, in the early to mid-1930s, Japan's current stable was basically the Aichi D3A and Yokosuka B4Y, two biplanes with top speeds under 200 miles an hour. While they were okay aircraft for late-era biplanes, aircraft in general were improving significantly, and the time of the monoplane was now, which then led to the Japanese Navy issuing specifications 10-shi in 1935 for a new torpedo bomber and specifications 11-shi in 1936 for a new dive bomber. In the 10-shi specifications, the Japanese Navy wanted a folding wing monoplane with a top speed that was greater than 200 miles an hour, that had a crew of 3, and that had a bomb load of 1,760 pounds, the weight of a single Type 91 torpedo. To these specifications, Nakajima would return with their Type K design, the clear favorite of the project, and Mitsubishi would return with their B5M design, the sort of younger brother and clear option B of the project. These two designs looked relatively similar and were of similar dimensions, although the Mitsubishi design would have fixed landing gear and a longer cockpit canopy. The Type K design, measuring in at 10.3 meters long, 15.52 meters wide, and 3.7 meters tall, it was a wide-wing monoplane, with wings that folded roughly around the midpoint. Initially outfitted with a Nakajima Hikari radial engine with 820 horsepower, the Type K could carry a max payload of the required 1,760 pounds, either in a single torpedo or in a small smattering of bombs to serve as a light level bomber, and it would have a token defensive armament of a single rear-facing 7.7mm machine gun. The Mitsubishi design was pretty much the same in most of these regards, although it was outfitted with a Mitsubishi Kinsei radial engine, with 1,000 horsepower. The Type K design would be the first to take to the air in January 1937, and would manage a top speed of 230 miles an hour, which doesn't sound like much, but for a torpedo bomber, an amazing top speed is not a necessary priority, and 230 miles an hour was still above the required 200 miles an hour. The overall flight characteristics of the design were solid, and aside from some minor issues regarding the plane's hydraulic wing folding mechanism, there wasn't much wrong with the Type K, and so by the end of 1937, the Type K officially won the design competition, being given the full name of Navy Type 97 Carrier Attack Bomber Model 1, or as it's more commonly known, the Nakajima B5N, and it would start to see combat use over in China by 1938. The Mitsubishi design, even though it lost the competition, also started to see a small production run, roughly around 100 strong, and it served a very minor role over in China as well. Meanwhile, over in the 11 project, competing alongside Aichi would be a couple of familiar faces, in Nakajima and Mitsubishi. Mitsubishi's design in this competition amounted to basically nothing, and Nakajima would make it a bit farther and submit their D3N design, a design that basically just looked like the B5N with a shorter cockpit canopy. Aichi, for their part, would submit their AM17 design, that, funnily enough, kind of resembled the Mitsubishi B5M, in having fixed landing gear. It's almost as if these two competitions mirrored one another, and this time, the Nakajima project was the little brother, and option B, the Aichi AM17 initially measuring in at, well, dimensions actually unknown to me, we'll get to that later, was a low-wing monoplane with fixed landing gear, powered by a less powerful Nakajima Hikari radial engine. This one with just 710 horsepower. The design was ideally to be able to hold a couple hundred pounds of explosives. First flying in January 1938, the Aichi design had significantly more issues than the B5N did, and its engine was found to be severely underpowered. Also, its dive brakes vibrated considerably, and it was found to be just overall unstable. This would send Aichi back to the drawing board, and sometime later, they returned with a new and improved plane. This one with a greater wingspan, larger tail surfaces that now extended further up the fuselage, a stronger engine in the Mitsubishi Kinsei with 840 horsepower, and overall stronger dive brakes. In this form, we now have some measurements, measuring in at 10.2 meters long, 14.37 meters wide, and 3.85 meters tall. Overall, the AM-17 was size-wise pretty close to the B5N, but with a top speed of 240 miles an hour, it was a little bit faster. It being a dive bomber instead of a torpedo bomber, its payload was smaller, with a total bomb load of 815 pounds, but it would have 3 machine guns instead of just 1, 2 forward-firing and 1 rear-firing 7.7mm machine guns. With the new and improved model, the AM-17 was accepted for production by December 1939, and was given the full name of Navy Type 99 Carrier Bomber Model 11, or simply the Aichi D3A. A month before officially being accepted for production, the initial D3A prototypes would actually go over to China, joining the B5N for some early pre-World War II combat experience. As the D3A would join the conflict a little bit later, it wouldn't have that much of a role over in China, but when it was used, it was generally fine. No major issues of note. Later going into production as the D3A1, they would swap out the engine to an improved and stronger version of the Kinsei, with around 1,000 horsepower. The B5N, on the other hand, after going into production as the B5N1, it would perform decently well against the technologically inferior forces of China, but the Japanese military did still realize that the design would have to be improved for the future, as they planned on fighting much more modern and high-powered aircraft. While it was performing well for a torpedo bomber, its top speed was still pretty low when compared to modern fighters, and as Japan often did not utilize armor or self-sealing fuel tanks, this made their planes particularly vulnerable. So either they could add some armor, or they could increase engine power, and Nakajima elected to go with the latter to try and boost top speed. Out would go the Nakajima Hikari, and in went the Nakajima Sakae, with 1,000 horsepower for the now named B5N2 model, and this was the same engine that the A6M Zero used. Weirdly enough, though, this new engine barely even boosted the top speed of the B5N, going from 230 up to 235 miles an hour. But still, the Sakae engines were more reliable than the Hikari engines, so there was still a benefit in swapping the engines around regardless. So with the B5N2 and D3A1 both being produced now, in addition to their very limited combat use in China, they started testing and training aboard Japanese carriers, and by late 1941, the D3A and B5N would embark on their first major mission outside of the Sino-Japanese War, in the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. For this attack, the majority of the force consisted of the D3A and B5N, and of the 353 aircraft-strong force, 131 of them were the D3A, and 143 were the B5N, to go along with 79 Zeros. The success or failure of this attack hinged, at least partially, on the effectiveness of the new line of carrier-based anti-ship aircraft, and as is very well known, the attack was very successful. The D3A would have the honor in quotation marks there, of dropping the first bombs on American forces in the Pacific Theater, and for the overall loss of 15 D3As and 5 B5Ns, Japan had destroyed 6 ships, damaged 13 more, destroyed almost 200 planes, damaged another 150 plus, and killed over 2,000 people. For Japan's purposes, the first significant combat use of the D3A and B5N was a rousing success. Strategically speaking, the D3A and B5N were a solid duo that complemented each other pretty well, and later on, and entirely by accident, ended up complementing each other even more. As the D3A didn't have a massive payload, it wouldn't be able to do that much damage to larger ships on its own. Outfitted with semi-armor-piercing bombs, they did do solid damage, to be sure, but not a lot. Initially, the strategy for the D3A was to outfit it with these semi-armor-piercing bombs and attack from above, in conjunction with the B5N attacking ships from at or below the waterline. It's this strategy that resulted in the D3A, along with the B5N, destroying the most Allied ships of any Axis plane in the Second World War, with the two aircrafts being a particular bane of shipping and other small vessels in the Pacific. But as for the accidental complementing of each other, in early 1942, a Japanese attack on British forces in Sri Lanka in what was known as the Indian Ocean Raid led to something pretty interesting, with the initial line of participating D3As outfitted with their semi-armor-piercing bombs. That initial force attacked the British ships, but they didn't do enough damage, which warranted a second strike. However, the D3As that were kept in reserve and would be going on this second strike were not sent out with armor-piercing bombs, but instead your standard bombs that would be used against your typical land-based targets. Presumably they ran out of armor-piercing bombs. Without that armor-piercing effect, you would imagine that these new bombs were less effective, but what the Japanese Navy found was that the removal of the armor-piercing effect meant that more damage was done to the anti-aircraft defenses on the decks of the ships, which meant that the subsequent aircraft that came in after these bombs were dropped could come in relatively unopposed to drop their payloads. This accidental discovery led to a general tactical shift for the Japanese Navy, and some number of D3As would be outfit with standard bombs to serve basically as anti-aircraft aircraft. Then, after the enemy defenses were neutralized, D3As with armor-piercing bombs and B5Ns would attack those crippled vessels, sinking them. Oftentimes, the B5Ns, with their larger torpedoes, ended up dealing the fatal blow, but still the D3As played a very important role. In the Indian Ocean Raid alone, with most of the damage being done after this tactical discovery, the D3A was a key participant in the destruction of at least 10 Allied ships, ships that were as small as corvettes and as large as the HMS Hermes, a light aircraft carrier. About a month later, in May 1942, going into the Battle of the Coral Sea, the D3A and B5N remained key players in the Japanese Navy, and they were part of the battle that could have, emphasis on could there, dealt a devastating blow to the Allied forces. The combined efforts of the B5N and D3A were enough to sink the USS Lexington, ultimately done in from 2 torpedoes and 2 dive bomber strikes, thus making the Lexington a split kill for the D3A and B5N, and the combined effort of several D3As was enough to nearly take down the USS Yorktown. While they ultimately failed to do so, the combined effort of Japan's anti-ship bomber aircraft managed to do a serious number on Allied ships in the early stages of the Pacific War, and they were a major reason why Japan was able to expand as rapidly as they did and as much as they did. But at the same time, though, by the Battle of the Coral Sea, there were some warning signs, namely in the fact that the D3A and B5N would start to see increased losses, with a roughly combined 50 of them being shot down in that battle alone. Whether it was due to tightening Allied defenses, improving defensive strategies, or just blind luck and chance, Japanese aircraft of all kind started seeing increasing losses around May 1942, and by June 1942, likely after the Battle of Midway that saw even more losses, but still some successes in the sinking of Allied ships, those increased losses led to the introduction of a new and improved D3A model in the D3A2, which would swap in a more powerful Kinsei engine with 1,300 horsepower, which ended up boosting the top speed from 240 miles an hour up to 267. The D3A2 was also slightly different visually speaking, with a slightly longer cockpit canopy. As the A2 model would come into increasing prominence, the general war situation was changing as well, and the roles of the D3A and B5N were changing along with it, as Japan had lost a number of their own carriers at Midway in the Battle of the Coral Sea, and were now switching to being on the defensive. The D3As and B5Ns started to be used more and more as land-based aircraft, attacking Allied ships that were landing on and hanging around places like Guadalcanal, and just the Solomon Islands in general. While they both continued to sink a number of Allied vessels, contributing to the plethora of ships resting in Iron Bottom Sound, and even on some occasions in the case of the D3A, serving as makeshift fighter aircraft, Allied tactical ships, and the introduction in late 1943 of planes like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair effectively spelled the beginning of the end for the dominance and prominence of the D3A and B5N. The Hellcats and Corsairs were just so much better than the Brewster Buffaloes and F4F Wildcats of the years prior. And honestly, even sans these new planes, Allied numerical advantage in general just started to wear down Japanese forces. The overall diminishing returns from both the D3A and B5N led to the eventual introduction of their successors in the Yokosuka D4Y and Nakajima B6N, respectively. However, due to a variety of issues, neither of these successor aircraft managed to fully replace their predecessors, meaning that in some capacity, the D3A and B5N served in the Japanese Navy until the war ended, serving almost like a washed-up boxer in deep financial debt. He's not there because he wants to be, but because he has to be. Because of initial engine issues in the D4Y, even though it actually participated in the Battle of Midway in very small numbers, it didn't start seeing significant use until around 1944. And even then, there was an additional problem that Japan's stable of late-war carriers were sometimes too small to fit the larger D4Y, which necessitated the use of the D3A on those small carriers. Now up against late World War II Allied fighters, the once vital and destructive D3A was a shadow of its former self, and would perform rather poorly. By the end of the war, because of its diminishing performance, the D3As were primarily being used as trainers and makeshift kamikaze aircraft. The B5N, on the other hand, would end up sharing a similar fate, as the B6N successor suffered from significant delays that meant it wasn't really until late 1943, early 1944 that they started seeing any significant use, and by that point, despite having better performance than the B5N, Allied aircraft had just improved too much, and much like the D4Y, the B6N was too large for some of Japan's carriers, which then forced the B5N to stay in service on those small carriers. By the war's end, the B5N was also largely serving as a trainer and as a kamikaze, now too a shadow of its former self. Ultimately, for the D3A and B5N, despite having a rather sad end to their respective careers, I do actually think they should be remembered alongside legendary Japanese planes like the Zero. With the combined power of the D3A, B5N, and A6M Zero, Japan dealt a massive blow to American forces at Pearl Harbor, took over the Philippines, took over most of Southeast Asia, and threatened to possibly take even more. Largely with the service of those 3 planes, Imperial Japan expanded greatly across the Pacific, leaving downed fighters and sunken ships in their wakes. But quite simply, they got old. Japan couldn't effectively replace them, and as they aged more like milk than fine wine. And instead perhaps aging into at least a nice piece of cheese, they instead turned into a gross mass that were just thrown at their enemies to be discarded and hopefully do some damage on the way out. A rather sad end for these once dominant planes. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Throughout the video, I thought about calling the D3A just the Val, and the B5N just the Kate, as those were their allied reporting names, just for the ease of pronunciation, but I felt like saying ships were being attacked by Vals and Kates just sounded a little weird. Like it just sounds wrong in some capacity. I don't know, maybe that's just me though. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.